Não me lembro de ver este anfiteatro com cadeiras suplementares em momento algum. I was saying this is the first time we have extra chairs in this room, so this is fantastic, okay, for us. We are very, very happy with it. Eu vou falar português, um pouquinho de inglês, tá bom? Mas... And now, não. E agora vamos dar início à nossa sessão com o professor Massimo Montanari. Massimo Montanari, professor catedrático emérito de História Medieval da Universidade de Bolonha, tem um currículo tão vasto que eu até tenho vergonha de dizer alguma coisa. Portanto, vou fazer assim, tipo um amuse-bouche, né? Uma coisinha só para entreter, porque o que nós queremos é ouvir o professor Massimo Montanari. Dentro das várias incursões pelo mundo que fez, para além da sua casa alma mater como professor, destaco o ter sido professor visitante convidado da École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, da Université Libre e também Paris, e depois da Université Libre de Bruxelas. Lecionou também cursos em várias universidades fora da Europa, mais precisamente na Universidade da Califórnia e em universidades japonesas e no Canadá. Fundador em 2001-2002 na Faculdade de Lettere e Filosofia da Universidade de Bologna do mestrado em História e Cultura da Alimentação. Fundador da revista Food and History, do Instituto Europeu de História e Culturas da Alimentação, que dirigiu até 2008. Foi galardoado em 2012 com o Prémio Rabelais, atribuído pelo Instituto de França, destinado a individualidades que se tenham distinguido internacionalmente no estudo, difusão e promoção da cultura da alimentação. Já nos honrou com a sua presença em vários eventos promovidos no âmbito das iniciativas da rede transnacional DIATA. Conforme atesta a memória fotográfica que partilharei no último dia do evento. Portanto, como estão a ver, o último dia é imperdível. Por ocasião da sua vinda a Portugal para participar em atividades nossas, foi eleito académico associado estrangeiro da classe de Artes, Letras e Ciências da Academia de Marinha de Lisboa. Belas memórias. Os estudos que publicou ao longo de várias décadas tornam-no uma referência mundial maior no domínio da História e Culturas da Alimentação. Sendo por demais conhecido do público especialista do nosso evento, não detalharei o vasto e incontornável corpus bibliográfico da sua autoria. Destaco somente Il cibo come cultura, Mangiare da cristiani, diete, digiuni, banchetti, etc., etc. Gusti del Medioevo, La cucina italiana, Storia di una cultura, e para o público lusófono, a mais conhecida, a mais usada, em coordenação com Jean-Louis Flandrin, a História da Alimentação, que já teve várias traduções em língua portuguesa, tanto portuguesa europeia como portuguesa do Brasil, não é? Estamos todos muito felizes de o ter connosco, professor Massimo Montanari. A palavra é sua e nós vamos agora deleitar-nos.
Buongiorno. Bom dia. I'm so happy to be here in Coimbra, in your university. Not for the first time, and I hope not for the last one.
It depends of us. it won't be the last time, but
I'm so happy to be with you, with Carmen, and so sono un po' emozionato. Come si dice in portoghese?
emocionado.
You have understood. So, in every time, in every place, in every culture, feast means food. This is a fundamental anthropological assumption expressed in different ways depending on the historical context and the real social context. I will refer to medieval Europe. Starting from the title I gave to my lecture, Peasant Food on Elite Tables, or When Festive Meals Become a Daily Habit. This title needs an explanation because it presupposes a certain idea of popular culture, that it's not a simple reflection of high culture, the result of imitative processes, but rather it expresses autonomous values and interests peculiar to the subaltern classes. I mean that the connection between feast and food, present at all social levels, has its own specificity in peasant culture, working as a food counter model based on the abundance and goodness of food in a context characterized at that social level by the fear of hunger, if not sometimes by actual hunger. In that context, the festive banquet is intended to exorcise the fear of hunger and propitiate the well-being of the community. The land of cocaine, how do you say in Portuguese? Cocaine. The land of cocaine, Greek utopia of medieval imagination, is a place where everything is food. Everything is feast. In this country, there are 4 Christmases, 4 Easters, 4 Candlemas, 4 Carnivals, and of course, there are also ordinary days, but they are all Sundays. This utopia embodies the desire to eliminate the distance between the daily and the festive, making the festive daily, that is, while eating. The connection is very simple and immediate. It also appears in proverbs and sayings that have reached our time. What is Easter? A 14th century English writer gets straight to the point. Easter is a day of joyful reflection and feeding. In addition to represent a break, a distance from everyday life, feast usually accords with natural rhythms, the cycles of sowing, harvesting, and so on. This also brings to a privileged relationship with the rural world, an archaic relationship, a true archetype that precedes the Christianization of feasts. That is a great cultural operation that affected the medieval centuries. Easter, for example, the feast of rebirth, the heart of Christian liturgy, reconfigures ancient feasts held around the spring equinox. Among the pagan Anglo-Saxons, in that period, the goddess Eostre was honored. Hence the name Eostur Monat that designated the month of April. The surprise is that the English Christian word for Easter is just Easter, that has been derived from that root, showing a nominal as well as substantial continuity. This is just one example of how, in the Middle Ages, the Church appropriated agricultural feasts, so constituting an agro-liturgical cycle characterized by annual and weekly rhythms. On the food level, the most decisive intervention was to assign two opposite dietary typologies to periods and days, fat and lean periods and days, differentiated by the permissibility or prohibition of eating meat and animal products. These rules changed over time and were different on a regional scale. Anyway, they governed food consumption throughout the Christian world, at least until the 16th century, when the Protestant Reformation rejected them. In medieval imagination, as well in the daily practices of the population, the idea of feast largely coincide with eating meat at all social levels. Among lords who exalted meat as a sign of strength and power and placed it at the center of daily consumption, among peasants who had it available more occasionally, but if they could, did not fail to eat meat on festive days. Among the clergy and the monks who abstained from it in different ways as a sign of humility, except recovering meat to honor an illustrious guest or, precisely, a feast. A beautiful episode told by Tommaso da Celano in the biography of St. Francis tells that once, when Christmas fell on a Friday, his companions were discussing what to do. Celebrate the holiday with a nice meat-based lunch or respect the abstinence of Friday. They sent one of them to ask Francis directly. He got angry and answered brusquely. Doing penance in a feast day is not admissible. It is a sin, and everyone must participate in Christmas celebration. Men, animals, the birds of the air, and why not the inanimate objects, Why not the walls? I want, Francis says, that on a day like this, even the walls eat meat. But as this is not possible, at least let's spread them with it, with grease on the outside. This is a very powerful image. These greased walls are the hyperbolic image of the bond between feast and meat that in medieval culture appears unbreakable. So was on Sundays that Christian Church was committed to promoting as days of feast in the Middle Ages. On that day, dedicating oneself to prayer and abstaining from work is mandatory, just as mandatory is to eat more and better, possibly meat. Even monks who observe strict rules of food control are forbidden to fast on Sundays. The prescription is reiterated, repeated in normative texts, both ecclesiastical and secular, while the lives of saints, the biographies of the saints, tell of farmers struck by divine fury because they dare to take up the hoe, or on a feast day. They dare to not work on feast day. Work done on Sundays prolongs the suffering of Christ. This is taught by a singular iconography attested in the Alpine regions of medieval Europe. It is called surrounded and tortured by work tools. We can deduce that the practice of weekly rest did not take hold without encountering resistance, but land inventories from the early Middle Ages suggest that the days of corvée for peasants were 6 per week. And the English agronomist Walter of Henley in the 13th century takes it for granted that the plough, l'aratro, has to remain still for 8 weeks a year. In addition to Sundays, in addition to solemn feasts like Easter, Christmas, Ascension, and so on, there were feasts dedicated to the Virgin, to the Baptist, to the apostles, to the patrons of each province or region. In monastic centers, more feasts were commissioned by kings or by a local lord in memory of someone who was to be guaranteed a good welcome in the afterlife. These practices were more or less widespread, depending on the period and the country, more numerous when and where the royal power directly controlled the monasteries, providing them with lands and resources in exchange for prayers, masses, and banquets in memory of someone. The logic, the idea that presided over these practices was a sort of circular equation. Good governance guarantees well-being, that is, an abundance of food. Festive banquets are the result of this abundance. In turn, banquets serve to propitiate the stability of the sovereigns and their good governance, as well as their eternal life. These food rituals have a religious and political meaning as well. For the Carolingian age, Michel Rouche tried to measure the impact of these festive occasions on the diet of monks and canons. The results are impressive. In royal monasteries, there are over 60 days of anniversaries and related feasts per year. In some cases, they are 70, 80, 100, always with a very high consumption of meat and wine or beer. We can therefore understand the attempts by abbots more sensitive to the theme of monastic spirituality to stem the proliferation of feasts, both in number and in the quantity and quality of food. Benedict of Aniane, who promoted a general reform of monastic life, tried, we don't know with what kind of success, tried to force monks to consume meat only at Christmas and Easter, and only poultry as prescribed by the rule of Benedict. Anniversaries were always linked to the day of death of the person to be remembered. Celebrating the day of birth, as we do today, was a pre-Christian practice still alive at a folkloric level, but viewed with suspicion and sometimes explicitly condemned by the church.
Water?
Yes, please. Just a bit of water. Gracias, obrigado.
Sì. Prego.
Festive banquets, copiously documented in monastic tradition, also appear among the aristocratic elite. Linked in this case not so much to religious occasions as to political dimensions and dynamics. For example, in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, the king was used to gather and host the magnates of the kingdom at his court to reaffirm his dominant role through the common banquet and the colossal drinking sessions that were an integral part of it. Furthermore, there were wedding feasts, which served to weave political alliance through family ties, links. Here too, feast coincides perfectly with the banquet. Wedding is the banquet, is the collective drink session. It is true that on a theoretical level, the only bond that confers indissolubility to marriage is the carnal copulation. But the table is an essential complement to the bedchamber. And in the collective perception, just the table is the decisive moment of the celebration, when the public social recognition of the gestures take place. In many wedding stories, the bedchamber is not even mentioned. They only talk about the banquet. Among the elite, wedding celebration can last days, weeks, months. It depends on the dignity and the prestige of the protagonists. Chronicles say that the wedding between Boniface of Canossa and Beatrix of Lorraine, celebrated in Italy in 1037, lasted 3 months. 3 months of banquets, convivia. Wedding and banquet overlap perfectly, according to the same mechanism of consequentiality that I already highlighted. Wedding is a feast. Feast is eating and drinking together. Wedding is eating and drinking together. To drink a feast is still said today in English. On these occasions, everything takes on hyperbolic dimensions and the ostentation of wealth reaches paradoxical levels. During the 3 months of the wedding between Boniface and Beatrix, spices, I am quoting, spices were not ground in a mortar, but ground like spelt in water mills. Nothing is said about the menu, but I want to underline just one thing. Spices are normal presences among the powerful. They are a sign of excellence that distinguishes the Lord's table from the peasant's table. This distinction, far from being exceptional, is a daily one. What can make it exceptional on certain occasions is only its measure. While documents provide us with much information about the feasts of religious and political elites, very little we know about common people, the poor, the pauperes, a term that medieval texts preferably use in a social than in an economic sense, to denote what today we could call the subordinate classes, the humble, the weak, as opposed to the powerful. Sometimes we are said that pauperes are given the leftovers from monastic banquets, or that some pauperes, representing the community as a whole, participated in the feast. Feeding the poor is a recurring clause in testamentary provisions, even if paradoxically, in such provisions, the role of the poor is totally occasional. As Jacques Le Goff pointed out, the poor simply serve to perform a rite whose aim is the salvation of the soul of the donors. On popular celebrations in the strict sense, documentary insights are sporadic and casual. But it is also true that the topic has not been studied so much. In particular, I think it would be interesting to investigate whether, beyond the daily diet of peasants that we can somehow reconstruct, there were special dishes for this or that feast. Piero Camporesi, the Italian scholar, wrote that popular cuisine, having an essential and long-term objective, such as daily survival, tends to be conservative and repetitive, while aristocratic or bourgeois cuisine, in a context of food security, can allow itself to vary and innovate. This assumption has an indisputable basis of truth, but I think it must be scaled down. Just starting from the topic we are considering here, that of festive dishes. In the world of paupers, celebrating feasts meant a temporary exit from the daily routine. The meaning of these celebrations must have been particularly strong on an emotional level, much more than among the social elite, who had no interest in breaking away from everyday life. Enriching and varying the diet on festive days must have been an important goal, especially, if not only, for ordinary people. That's why I believe that popular cuisine is not at all incompatible with invention and creativity. They could be expressed in the preparation of some meat, mainly of farmyard animals, more familiar to the peasant experience, and perhaps more often by reworking the basic resources of the daily peasant diet: starchy foods, cereals, and vegetables. Interesting recipes could emerge from this kind of practices, to be presented only exceptionally in popular menus, but also accepted, somehow enriched and reworked into the canon of the haute cuisine. Here, substantially deprived of their festive meaning. The presence of popular recipes, flavors, and tastes in medieval haute cuisine has been, for Italy at least, amply demonstrated. Did festive dishes from popular tradition flow into this heritage? This is an idea that does not seem unlikely. I would love to explore it further, but at the moment it is only a hypothesis. As an example of possible research tracks, I quote a text that I find particularly interesting. It refers to the monastery of Camaldoli in central Italy, a very particular monastery, not a place of power and abundance like those of the Carolingian age that I mentioned before, but a place of prayer and isolation, with headquarters in a place called Fonte Bono, and a few kilometers away, a group of cells, celle, where the monks occasionally retreat in solitude. These hermits receive food from the headquarters, from Fonte Bono, and the consuetudines, the customs drawn up by Abbot Rudolf around the middle of the 12th century, at a certain point, focus on the festive specialties that must appear on their table on Sundays and other solemnities. As you can see, not even these hermits can elude the obligation of the feasts with their food corollary. Given the cultural context in which their experience takes place, we can be sure that these are poor foods, which recall peasant uses and not aristocratic ones. So it is not surprising that the main protagonists are cereals and legumes, occasionally enriched by cheeses. The reference to popular use is explicit by the first dish mentioned in the document, a small wheat pasta, which people, vulgus, call little grains, granelli. A rustic dish of spelt is served at Christmas and Easter. Then appear distributed throughout the different periods of the liturgical calendar, cakes, pies, and migliacci, millet-based preparation, dishes of chickpeas and summer broad beans, tortelli, and fritters, frittelle. The same preparations, plus a few others, compensate for the hermit's menu on the days when blood sampling is practiced, as if to say that they are considered rich and nutritious food. That's why they appear among the festive ones. Here, the spelt dish reappears, and again the dish of granelli, pasta which people call granelli, vulgus, and finally the lasagne, lagana. This text is the mirror of peasant poverty, which for the Camaldoli monks represents a model of simple and humble life. So it helps us to give the right place, to give a poor social place in the middle of the 12th century to some gastronomic preparations, this time to be widely successful in medieval Italy. Torte, cakes, pasta wrappers filled with various ingredients. And I know that already we find these torte in some agricultural contracts of the early Middle Age as a donation given by peasants to the lords. And then tortelli, smaller pies that in the following centuries will become a strong dish of the Italian cuisine. Lasagne, which, if I'm not mistaken, we find here for the first time in Italian sources. A few decades later, the dictionary of Uguccione da Pisa confirms their popular use when it states that these types of cut pastry, boiled and fried, a vulgo dicuntur lasagna, are called lasagna by the people. Accurate recipes for lasagne, as well as for tortelli and other pasta shapes, appear in the elite cookbooks from the 14th and 15th centuries. Books intended for the lords, for the kings, which collect recipes from different sources. Many of them are the result of the imagination and professionalism of court and or palace cooks. Others seem to derive from popular experience. Tracking them down and placing them in an original festive context is a very delicate and risky operation, perhaps not impossible. I think, anyway, that the issue is worth to be carefully explored. And I thank you per avermi ascoltato.
Nós é que agradecemos o privilégio que foi ouvir com a profundidade a que nos habituou o professor Massimo Montanari. Convido-vos agora a uma pausa para o primeiro refresco matinal e começaremos aqui neste mesmo lugar ao quarto depois das 11. Portanto, temos um intervalinho. O refresco está em cima no quinto piso. You have to go to the